Okay, we're back. And before the break, we were talking about making sure that you have the correct hardware, you have the correct firmware. In this page, as you can see, we've mentioned that you could use Skyline Health to verify hardware compatibility. So when you look at the illustration on the right side of the page, here you can see that we have an entire section when it comes to do you have the right hardware or not. And ideally, this is what you want to see. If you never use Skyline Health, what you may get instead of this is potentially warnings. Now in class, don't be surprised when you get warnings because we use embedded ESXi hosts. But in real life, you want to see everything in green. Notice there's a section for the controller. And you can see here you have a green check mark when it comes to the controller being VMware certified. Notice you have another section for the controller driver. And you have another one for the controller firmware. So once again, if you already have a cluster in place, go take a look and make sure that everything is supported. One of the things that you could do is every so often update your vSAN hardware compatibility list database. And as you can see, this is something that you could do using the vSphere client. If your vCenter is connected to the outside world, you can get the latest version online. Otherwise, you could use the option, update from file. Now, in this page, we talk about how, if you want, you could update drivers firmware. Now here we don't show you the easiest way to do it. Here we're talking about how to do it with the command line. Now let's take a look at this command. If you look at this command is the ESXi software vib install command. So in this case, we're trying to install a package, a vib, that happens to come in a zip format. Now, if you have a small environment, there's nothing wrong with doing this using the command line. But as your environment gets bigger, you want to automate that. So you don't really want to use the command line unless you have to. Now, if you never use this command, here again, what we're doing is we're using PuTTY to connect to one of the ESXi hosts. And if you take a look, one of the things you could do is you could type ESXi space software space vib space list. And that will show you all the packages that you have installed and the version of each package. There's also a get option that I'm going to show you in my demo. And again, this one not only shows you which packages you have installed, but it also shows potential dependencies. And there you can see that you also have an install option. So in this case, I would have to download the zip file, make it accessible to the ESXi server so I could install it manually. Now, instead, we recommend that you use vSphere Lifecycle Manager. And when you take a look, VMware has made significant changes to the way that we update, potentially patch, or upgrade your hardware, your ESXi service, and your overall cluster. So here, first and foremost, we explain to you what is vSphere Lifecycle Manager. You can see it says at the very top, vSphere Lifecycle Manager is a unified software and firmware management utility that uses the desired state model for all lifecycle operations. So the idea is, number one, this piece of software is going to take a look to see if you are compliant or not. And if need be, we could always do remediation. So for example, you may want to take a look and quickly realize that, let's say for argument's sake, you're not using the latest version of the firmware that we support. At that point, remediate simply means update that particular vib. And when you take a look, here we mentioned the concept of a base image. We mentioned potential vendor add-ons. These will be drivers from different vendors. And again, besides that, firmware and driver add-ons. Now, when you take a look at the vSphere client, if you look add the icon on the home page called Lifecycle Manager. Very quickly, you can see all these options. So when it comes to the vendor plugins, you better believe that we have plugins from different vendors. In this page, they mention, for example, the ones from Dell and HP. So when we look at this page, here, we're talking about the capabilities of Lifecycle Manager. And what I'm going to do here is I'm going to refer to this as VUM version 2. This is the replacement to Update Manager. So if you're familiar with Update Manager, then you know exactly what this utility can do. Again, this is like Update Manager on steroids. If you look at the bullets, take a look at the first one. With Lifecycle Manager, I could patch up a host or I could upgrade the host. Some of you guys in the past may have used baselines. Now you can use not only baselines, but you could also use images. You can see with this utility, you can install and update third-party software. And again, you could use the same image for all your servers in the cluster. Once again, with this utility, I could update ESXi drivers and firmware. And notice you could also update VMware tools and virtual machine and hardware versions. Now, when we look at this particular page, one of the things that they mentioned here is that nowadays, as you create the cluster, you can associate the cluster to an individual image. So you do that as you create the cluster. Now, when you take a look here, it says, if you work with images, an image is created locally from a desired state criteria comprised of the hypervisor base image and vendor drivers and firmware. Now, when you look at this page, remember, you have on one hand your base image. So that would be the software that you typically install when you deploy an ESXi server. But in this case, we're talking about combining that image with firmware and drivers add-on. You can see references there to storage devices, your network cards, besides that, your I/O controllers and so on. So we're talking about grouping together the base image, drivers, and also firmware. Now, when you look at this page, what we tell you in this page is that if you want to use images, not baselines, but images, your environment needs to be running 7.0 or above. Now, to use baselines, you could be using baseline, of course, for 6.7 or even 7.0. But again, images only work in 7x. Now, let's take a look at this page. Here you can see that in this case, we're selecting a cluster. You can see the cluster is called the vSAN cluster. And what they're doing here, as they select the cluster, they go to the tab called Updates. Again, take a look on the right side. At that point, they select the option Image. And what you're doing here is you are deciding to move away from baselines. And obviously, you want to start using images. So what you have to do is you have to define an image. So notice you get to select the ESXi version. You can click on select next to vendor add-ons. This is optional. And again, you could add some of these additional vendor add-ons. And you can do the same exact thing when it comes to firmware and drivers. Now, when you take a look, what we're showing you here is what I was mentioning a minute ago. As you create the cluster, at the very top, you give the cluster a name. Then you select whether you want to use vSAN with HA and DRS. You can choose all three. You could technically only choose vSAN, but you don't want to do that. You want to combine it with HA and DRS. And then you click on the box saying manage all hosts in the cluster with a single image. As you can see here, once you do that, you get to choose the ESXi version of your choice and potentially any vendor add-ons. Now, we've mentioned the term remediate before. Remember, that means that you want to potentially patch up something or update something in particular. So here it says when you remediate a cluster, vSphere Lifecycle Manager applies the following elements to all the hosts in your cluster. Once again, number one, your base image. Then potentially also user-specified components, firmware and driver add-ons, and so on. And if I look at this page, here they're showing you that after I finish lecturing, you get to do your first lab. So let's talk about that lab. In that lab, you get to log into our kit. Now you get to take a look at what you have. And you're going to quickly realize that in this lab, you combine the GUI and the command line. You're going to take a look at how many clusters you have. The answer is 2. You're going to take a look at how many hosts per cluster. The answer to that is 4 per cluster. You're going to take a look at how many disk groups you have. How big is your vSAN data store? And you're going to run a few commands. All right. So on that note, I'm going to do a quick demo. And then after the demo, you get to have some fun. You get to do lab number 1. All right. Thank you. And please pay attention to my demo. Thanks a lot.